This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
I'm Tom Hoppe, and I'm your host of the Most Painful Podcast. In the last episode, we spoke to Dominic Allington, who spoke about how chronic pain is dealt with in England and how they help veterans over there with chronic pain. So there are some interesting things they're doing, so you can go back and listen to that episode. In season 1, we talked about cannabis and how it can help with chronic pain. And today, I'm joined once again by Jason Busse, who's with McMaster's Health Science, who's just completed research comparing opioids to cannabis. Jason, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I think I'll start with, we talked a little bit about this offline at the CPS, but I think maybe for our audience, you can talk about what the research question was and how it can help with chronic pain.
Yeah, absolutely. So increasingly, as there has been a growing awareness of the potential harms associated with opioids in particular, there's been growing interest in alternatives. One of those alternatives is cannabis. And so we were curious to understand what the relative effectiveness was and harms of opioids versus cannabis, particularly when used to manage chronic pain.
And what was the results out of that research?
So we ended up doing something called a network meta-analysis. There's only ever been one small trial that has directly compared a form of cannabis against opioids. Very small study on neuropathic pain, and it was too small to give a conclusion. But there's been a lot of studies that have looked at opioids versus placebo and a fair number of studies that have looked at cannabis versus placebo. And so by virtue of that common comparator, placebo, we're able to statistically model the comparative effectiveness of cannabis against opioids to create the trials that haven't appeared in the literature yet. So when we did this and we looked at how they compared in terms of effectiveness, it seemed as if they were fairly similar. Both opioids and cannabis have the potential to provide small but important pain relief. They're not going to be effective for the majority of individuals that try them, but about 1 in 10 patients will find an important degree of pain relief. We found that they are similarly effective for increasing physical functioning in a minority of patients, and similarly effective in terms of improving sleep quality in a minority of patients once again. So neither of these is a cure for chronic pain, neither is a panacea. They do appear to have important benefits for a minority of individuals that trial them, and the benefits appear to be fairly similar. Now, when you look at harms, we found that patients were more likely to discontinue opioids in a clinical trial because of problematic side effects than they were to discontinue with cannabis. So it appears as if the cannabis that was used in the trials, which was non-inhaled therapeutic forms of cannabis, was better tolerated by more patients than opioids were. And of course, we also know that you can, in rare circumstances, experience a fatal overdose with opioids. You cannot fatally overdose with cannabis. So in sum, what our study has suggested is that it appears to be reasonable for patients who have not found relief with more conventional methods and are considering whether they want to engage in a trial of opioids or therapeutic cannabis. It seems to make sense to give the cannabis a try first and see if there is important benefit that's achieved, because they do appear to be similarly effective to opioids, but they do have a lower risk of these rare but very serious harms.
Is that because the way the receptors accept each drug? Is that, or why is that?
Well, yeah, so opioids depress the respiratory system when taken at high doses, and cannabis works on different receptors. They do not suppress the respiratory system. This is why with opioids we get very concerned about co-prescribing with other central nervous system suppressants like benzodiazepines, for example, because they can have that an added effect of combining the two. So they do work in different receptors, and the receptors that the opioids target do, in some cases, lead to these catastrophic harms. And again, it is not overly common to fatally overdose when using prescription opioids for chronic pain. If you're looking at the absolute risk, it's about 1 in 1,000. So it's not common, but it can happen. And again, because of how cannabis interacts with the system, they cannot cause a fatal overdose.
And when we talk about health-wise and harm, what about metabolic health from each of the drugs? I mean, opioids is hard on your system. My understanding of what about cannabis?
Yeah, so we know more about the long-term effects of chronic opioid use than we do about the long-term effects of chronic therapeutic cannabis use. And so we don't have a lot of evidence to be able to say. We have looked at this, we've looked at the studies on long-term harms, and there's unfortunately more questions than there are answers. For people that are using inhaled forms, there does appear to be an increased risk of lung associated issues, greater risk of bronchitis, chronic cough, things of this nature. With either of these drugs, there is the potential of becoming addicted. We know a bit more about the risk of opioids in that regard. It's about 5.5% of individuals that are prescribed opioids for chronic pain will develop an addiction to them. We do know that opioids can lead to issues that with the neuroendocrine system, hypogonadism, for example. So, in terms of cannabis, we know less about the long term harms. It's a critical area of study, but any type of psychotropic medication that you're taking for a prolonged period of time does have the potential to affect other systems beyond the system in which you're trying to take it to have a benefit for.
Now, therapeutic cannabis, is it not a different makeup than what what other people would consider run-of-the-mill cannabis?
Yeah, it's a complex area. When you talk about therapeutic cannabis, it can be synthetic products which physicians can prescribe. They do have a drug identification number, things like nabilone, things like Sesmet. But a lot of the products that are being used are not these synthetic products. They might be extracts from the cannabis plant that are suspended in oil, and you can take them through a spray or an oil filled capsule. In some cases, in fact, in many cases, individuals will look at inhaled products that they either vaporize or they might smoke. But in general, when you talk to people and you survey people that are using cannabis therapeutically, they tend to favor products that either have a higher amount of CBD, cannabidiol, which is the non psychotropic cannabinoid in cannabis. It does not cause euphoria. You cannot get high with it. You can't get addicted. Or they turn to products that have balanced ratios of CBD and THC. And THC, of course, is the psychotropic cannabinoid that does cause the euphoria that is associated with the adverse effects. When you look at recreational users, they will tend to gravitate towards products that are much higher in THC because that is the cannabinoid that provides the recreational properties. So there's areas of gray, and there are certainly individuals that will endorse both therapeutic and recreational use of cannabis at the same time. But in general, when you look at the therapeutic products, they tend to be lower and sometimes absent in the amount of THC that they contain.
So when the with a therapeutic, if there's no THC, then the addiction, of course, is a lot lower than there would be with the opioids.
Well, absolutely. You cannot become addicted to cannabidiol. It simply has never been documented or recorded. It doesn't have those kinds of properties. So for those individuals that are taking only CBD dominant products, their risk of addiction should essentially be zero.
And when you're looking at the literature, people, and you're comparing opioids to cannabis, is it all spectrums of cannabis? So with THC or CBT, or is it just the CBT, the therapeutic cannabis?
We tend to find, so you're not seeing trials where people are being administered products with high THC in general. You are seeing some studies where it's pure CBD. You see a number of studies where it's sort of a balanced ratio of THC to CBD. The large majority of trials are non-inhaled cannabis products that are being tested: oils, drops, sprays, things of this nature. That's an important limitation, though, because we know a number of individuals that are using cannabis therapeutically do look at inhaled products. Well, why would they do that? You do take on the potential risk of lung harm when you're inhaling a product, but you also get a much faster mechanism of action. So when you inhale a cannabis product, you feel the effects within minutes. When you ingest a cannabis product or use it as a topical, that's also an available preparation, it has to be metabolized by your system before you notice the effects. And that could take hours. So, again, sometimes for a faster mechanism of action, people might turn to an inhaled product. We know a number of people using cannabis therapeutically do, and we desperately need trials of the products that people are actually using. So there's a limitation out there with what the evidence has to tell us versus the kinds of products that a number of people are currently using.
And would this be the reason from, when you look at your research and you say it's about equal between opioids and cannabis, is this because the THC is not in the cannabis and or there's such a mix of use out there that you're not able to get a more clearer picture?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what we find with these trials is they often allow individuals to modify their dose, modify how much they're using after they've been randomized. So what we've tried to do in some cases is get administrative data from licensed producers. Some of these companies will actually try to capture data from their patients that are using their products on apps that they download, for example, to try to give that level of granular detail. What about people that are using different products, different compositions, different frequencies? So we're starting to get a bit of a sense of it, but it's again more questions than answers. The other thing that's quite interesting when we talk to patients is they will often tell us that they have to engage in sort of a personal journey of exploration when it comes to cannabis. There's limited guidance out there. This is not a topic that is taught in medical school, for example. So they end up trying to get information, sometimes from the companies that are selling these products, sometimes from the representatives from these companies, sometimes by talking to other people they know that have been using cannabis. But for those that find success with this product, and again, it's not everyone, it's probably a minority of individuals, they often have to experiment for quite some time before they land upon a combination of products that they find works best for them and reduces the unwanted side effects.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, then I guess for the cannabis side, more, I guess, rigor in how the research is conducted so that it's could be replicated versus having such a wide variety between individuals.
Yeah, and again, what we really need is more trials that test the products that people are using. So we've got, a lot of trials on these synthetic forms of cannabis. Not a lot of people are using these in real life. So we need more trials that test the products that people are actually using so we can give them better information when they make decisions about whether or not to pursue those products.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So to kind of just summarize that first part of our talk is from what you've seen in the literature, the effect is this about the same between opioids and cannabis, if I understood you.
Yeah, now that's on average. So that's on average. So another limitation of these studies is we talk a lot about average effects, and not everyone is average. So again, what we need more information on as well is, can we start to learn what features are associated with people that respond to these types of interventions versus people that don't? When it comes to opioids, we've learned a little bit more about this. People have mapped certain genetic features that can tell us if you're likely to be a fast or a slow metabolizer of opioids. And obviously, people that are very slow metabolizers, they don't get a whole lot of benefit. People that are very fast metabolizers, they get a very rapid onset. So we need to learn more about individual features that can help predict whether an individual patient is likely to see benefits with certain cannabis products, or perhaps even an opioid in some cases.
But then, of course, the second part to that is the harm that each of these provide, and sounds to me like cannabis is going to be less harmful than taking an opioid.
Yeah, that and it's not harm free. It's
Obviously, yeah.
not harm free, but it does appear to have a better safety profile than opioids. Again, particularly because you cannot fatally overdose on cannabis. They're both psychotropic agents. You will develop physical dependence on cannabis products with THC and also with opioids. That means it's can be difficult to stop once you've been taking that for a little while. In a minority of cases, you can become addicted to either of these substances. And as you alluded to before, chronic use of these psychotropic agents will, in some cases, have effects on other systems. and that's not always entirely predictable. In rare cases, for example, they've even documented something called opioid-induced hyperalgesia, which is cases where people actually develop pain that's being caused by the opioids that they're taking. So it gets very complex. And this is why a lot of the chronic pain programs right now are doing their best to try to engage patients in active approaches that they feel will ultimately have long-term benefit. Graduated activity and mindfulness and meditation and sleep hygiene protocols. But the reality is these things are often not sufficient for a number of people that live with chronic pain. And so to find relief from those symptoms, to try to improve sleep, to try to get that little bump improved function, there are these options out there. They will work for some people. They won't work for other people. And unfortunately, until we learn more about the individual features that can help predict who will and who won't be a responder, it's often left up to the individual, ideally working with their healthcare provider, to do a number of, N of one, as we call them, experiments. Try this, see if it works. If not, change the dose a little bit, change the product, see if you get relief. And, at a certain point in time, you have to make a decision if something is working sufficiently for you that you want to keep trying it, or if it's not, you have to move on to something else. And that's a very frustrating aspect of chronic pain. It would be wonderful if we had, therapies out there. They work for everybody, but that's not the case. And it's certainly not the case with either cannabis or opioids as well.
Well, it sounds like the Dr. Peter Attea approach, right? Here's the research. You have to figure what kind of works for you as an individual and go from there, right? So we also talked offline. You're starting some other work on cannabis. We only have a couple minutes left. Maybe you can just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so we are updating a cannabis guideline where we've expanded the sort of scope of what we've done previously. We are now looking to find whatever information is available on inhaled products. We're trying to really understand how much patients value the benefits that they acquire from cannabis versus the harms that they experience. We are trying to sort of give more details about the harms of both ingested and inhaled forms so patients can make decisions about that. So we do anticipate having that guideline out in 2024. We're sort of wrapping it up right now and putting it together. But that will be a body of work that will sort of pull together all of the current evidence that we have in terms of benefits and harms of cannabis, impacts on driving, impacts on work, so that we can provide information to help patients make good decisions based on their own preferences and their sort of tolerance for the benefits in terms of the harms that we understand.
Do you think that'll make its way into the standard of care for doctors?
I so I do think so, but I will sort of note one caveat with that. When we make our guidelines, we can either make a strong recommendation for something or a conditional recommendation. Strong recommendations require that we have good evidence that either the benefits clearly exceed the harms, in which case it would be a strong recommendation in favor, or good evidence that the harms clearly exceed the benefits, in which case it would be a strong recommendation against. And in cases where the benefits and harms are closer together or where the evidence isn't as good, we make conditional recommendations. The reason we call them conditional is they are conditional on individual patients' values and preferences. And my very strong suspicion is that when it comes to cannabis, we are going to be left to make a number of conditional recommendations. So, for that to be implemented in practice, ideally, it would mean that when you came to your healthcare provider with a complaint of chronic pain, perhaps asking directly about cannabis, or perhaps you would have tried other things and they hadn't worked, and your healthcare provider was starting to think of maybe cannabis might be a reasonable next choice. It would not be a decision that would happen without a discussion with the patient, right? So the best standard of practice for a conditional recommendation is the patient is provided with the best information we have on the benefits, the best information we have about the harms, and they are encouraged to then make a decision consistent with their values and preferences. It may be that some patients look at what we believe the benefits are likely to be with cannabis and say, I'm not interested. It's not enough. I've had some poor experiences with cannabis in the past, or I have to work a job where I'm not willing to take any chances about my level of alertness, for example. And so best practice was probably going to mean shared decision making with patients, use of decision aids, and helping patients to make those informed decisions.
Yeah, because like you said before, there's such a wide variety of how it's going to impact each person differently.
Yeah, and again, the enormous amount of products that are out there. This is not simply just a pill. In many cases, there are literally hundreds of products. Ingested, inhaled, topicals, vaped. It's a very busy landscape, and we do need to provide more help to patients that are interested in terms of navigating this. They shouldn't have to turn to representatives from the companies that have a vested interest in them buying the products to get their information. There needs to be trusted resources that they can turn to for this.
Well, it does sound like a very confusing landscape, and I'm sure your research is what's going to help bring some clarity to it for people that need to use this product.
I certainly hope so.
Well, Jason, it was great to have you back on the show. Thanks for being on the show again.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. And to our audience, our next show, we're going to be talking about TBIs and concussion. There's some research on that. We're going to bring the principal investigator on that project in to talk about that. For feedback about the show or more information on chronic pain, you can visit our website, veteranschronicpain.ca, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Chronic Pain COE and on Instagram at chronicpain_COE. Once again, Jason, thanks for being on the show. And to our audience, stay safe and keep the hope alive.
The Most Painful Podcast
is produced for the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence by Story Studio Network and Eye Contact Productions.